Now, that massive search and rescue underway in the North Atlantic after a submersible exploring the wreck of the Titanic went missing on Sunday. The research vessel, Polar Prince, lost contact with the crew of the Titan sub about an hour and 45 minutes into its dive. The US Coast Guard estimated the sub has between 70 and 96 hours of emergency oxygen. That was at 5 p.m. yesterday. The tour firm Ocean Gate said it was exploring all options to get the crew back safely, and government agencies have joined the rescue operation too. Let's speak with Jerome Starkey, defence editor at The Sun. Jerome, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
This is a very disturbing story. I mean, at the moment we know that it's got lost. There's been no contact. What's the procedure here? I mean, this is needles and haystack territory, isn't it?
Well, the most important factor is that it's in very, very deep water. The sea floor where the wreck of the Titanic is lying is 3,800 metres, more than 12,000 feet deep. Now, that's well beyond the range of any known submarine rescue capability. I mean, most of the submarine rescues, most of the military submarines in the world operate at around between 200 and 250 metres below the surface of the sea. So, you know, submarines can go deeper, and indeed the UK, among other nations, has capabilities to rescue submarines down to about 1,000 metres, but at a depth of almost 4 kilometres, it's very, very difficult. So what we know is happening at the moment is that the US and Canadian Coast Guards have both launched aircraft, C-130 Hercules aircraft, and indeed a Poseidon P-8 specialist submarine hunting aircraft, and that's been dropping sonar buoys into the sea around where they think the Titan went missing, to try and see if they can hear any noise under the water coming from the missing submarine, or indeed its crew trying to make any noise or any kind of communications. But I think it's important to say that, you know, all of the people who are experts in this area have been very clear that the prospects for the people on board the Titan are very, very bleak. Because even if it was located, that's where the problems almost begin, right? Because you can't send a diver down there. Nobody can get down there and manually address the situation, I would assume. There are only a handful of vessels which can submerge safely to that sort of depth, and they're vessels like the Titan, small, specialist, deep sea submarines. Now, rescue submarines are designed to be able to dock with a stricken vessel, and in order to sort of create a safe seal so that crew members can leave. But there isn't, as that I'm aware of, there isn't a rescue submarine that can get to that depth. And that's the problem. It's the depth. They talked about there being, I suppose now, about 80 hours of oxygen in there. I mean, this is a very small piece of kit, right? It's 7 metres or something like that. 5 people on board. It would have been snug anyway. I mean, this will be an incredibly traumatic experience for those on board, no matter how experienced adventurers and the like they might be. Indeed, and that estimate of 96 hours oxygen, of course, is based on certain assumptions about how people are breathing and how they're exhaling and what their state of mind is. And clearly, and that nothing's happened to them. And that nothing's happened to them. You know, in the event of something going wrong, you can expect people may well be panicking and maybe consuming that oxygen at a slightly faster rate. And in terms of locating it, I mean, he's sending, as you say, equipment down to be able to ping back a message that they think they've found something. I mean, how difficult is that part of this? Well, submarine hunting is something that the military's what the global militaries specialise in, particularly NATO and the Americans, of course, because the presence of submarines in international and domestic waters is something they take very, very seriously. So, you know, there's an awful lot of technology invested in this sort of science, but ultimately it comes down to sonar once you're in the water. I mean, most of it is, you know, you can do all sorts of clever things with tracking radio frequencies on the surface, and perhaps signatures of, you know, temperature signatures or emission signatures from diesel submarines. But, you know, down at that depth, they're listening. They're listening for sounds that the submarine may be making, or any kind of transmissions, electronic transmissions it's making. And it's not, you know, I was sort of reminded of when I think some people got stuck in a cave or something, and, you know, half the world seemed to have a plan or an idea in Thailand, wasn't it? When, you know, oh, maybe we could do it this way, or there's another way to do this, and you had all these sort of almost armchair rescuers coming up with ideas, and some of them were fairly good ideas, and I think to a point some of them might have even been implemented. But this is
this is sort of different territory. There's certain laws of physics involved here that no matter how worthy your thoughts or ideas might be, you can't just circumnavigate things that physically cannot be done. And that's just to nip down in a vessel and go and have a look, because you can't just do that at that depth.
You can't do that. And I think, you know, one of the most sensible analyses I've seen so far was pointing out that, you know, had the people behind the Titan had a recovery vehicle on standby on the mothership available to launch immediately, then perhaps that would have given them their best prospects of recovering the Titan and saving the lives of the crew on board. But from what I've seen so far, that is not the case. And indeed, the research and rescue operation, as it's currently being described, seems to be led by, you know, the Canadian and the US Coast Guards with military support.
Yeah. And I guess people will debate this for a long, long time, regardless of the outcome. And obviously, you know, we all hope there is a positive outcome here, even if it is that the odds are sort of stacked against that. But it's bound to call into question the system that they have here. That, you know, if you're quite rich, you pay a lot of money, and a fella takes you down in a submarine, basically. And quite a crude version of one, looking at it. I mean, I'm sure it ticks all the boxes to a certain level, but this is essentially just a cylinder with a joystick, and somebody navigates their way around the seabed. It's kind of as simple as that, which seems utterly crazy in some respects that this even exists.
I mean, it's inherently dangerous to do what they've done. And the fact that it's such a niche and difficult thing to do is no doubt why it's such an exclusive experience, and why people appear to have been prepared to pay so much money for the opportunity to go down and see the wreck. But it's precisely because it's so niche and it's so difficult to get there that it's also so difficult to try.
Yeah. But others have done it, of course. I mean, you know, they have been, the tour firm have previously sent these vessels down there anyway, so they will say, well, look, our track record is good. But I don't imagine it's something that happens on the hour, is it?
No, and we know that on this particular occasion, indeed, one of the passengers had tweeted before the dive that he thought this would be the only manned dive to the wreckage of the Titanic this year, because the weather had been particularly bad and they'd been suffering from storms. But he said there was a weather window which he thought was going to allow them to dive. So we don't know yet whether that weather window closed, whether whether, you know, what has happened is in any way related to the sea conditions or the weather conditions around. But
well, I was going to say, is there a kind of a theory, a best guess at what sort of things can go wrong with that? I mean, there's the obvious that it's just very dangerous, taking something down at those kind of depths and all the potentials. But are there known hazards to doing this in terms of the strength or the capability of the vessel itself, etc.?
Well, there are two likely scenarios. One is that for whatever reason they've lost the ability to manoeuvre the submarine, to control it. Now that could be for a variety of reasons. It could be a failure of the battery or the engine or the steering, but for some reason they can't control it. Some speculation, for example, is clearly just speculation that they might have become trapped in the wreckage somehow, but they can't move. That's scenario number one. Scenario number two is that the pressure hull has failed and that the submarine has been crushed. Now, if that's the case, then they will all be dead instantly, and there'll be very little left of the Titan that took them down. Clearly, at this stage, there's no communication with them, so there's no way of knowing what has happened.
So if this thing just, in crude terms, just stopped working X amount of meters on the way, it would then potentially just sink to the bottom, one would assume.
Well, I think that would depend on assumptions on what was controlling the vessel's buoyancy. Submarines obviously have mechanisms for coming up and down, usually in a controlled fashion. If they've lost control of their buoyancy, if the submarine has had some sort of failure, then it may well sink. I mean, clearly those are the scenarios. If you think back to the Russian submarine, the Kursk, that sank in the Barents Sea, it sank to the bottom, but that was in about 100 meters of water. More recently, there was an Argentinian submarine, I think it was the San Juan, that sank in much, much deeper water. But in both cases, none of the crew survived.
And in terms of the kind of brains behind these things. I mean, I mentioned that it does look very basic. I suppose it would be argued there's a reason for that. You know, there's not going to be sort of beds in there and, you know, larders and fridges. That's not the point. You build it to a certain spec, but it's bound to call into question the kind of, you know, dare I say, the health and safety side of these kind of trips. I know that people who embark on that kind of stuff, whatever it is, there's a danger, and that's almost part of the kind of interest for some people, that it is a risk in doing it. But it's bound to change the terms, I would have thought, about the future of these kind of explorations.
It may, and yet I imagine that there will still be people who want to do these kinds of exciting, thrill-seeking, unique and expensive journeys.
Yeah.
We know that, you know, one of the passengers had taken a commercial flight to the edge of space. You know, these are sort of clearly hard-to-get experiences that people are prepared to pay money for.
Indeed. Jerome, thank you for your time. Good to see you. Jerome Starkey, Defence Editor over there at The Sun.